But for me, at the end of the day, my whole goal is to get people to understand what does it for them, what processes lead to bottles that do it for them, and how you can identify those. So my favorite thing to do is to blind taste people. Whenever I do whiskey tasting events with people, about 90% of the time I roll with blind taste tests, right? Because if I set down 3 whiskeys in front of you and you think you know them, you will have formed an opinion about something that I can't break you from, right? But if I sit you down and say, we try those 3 in a blind format, 2 of them are ones that you know very well, but you don't know them because, again, blind format. And then the third one is a $25 bottle, right? You'd be surprised how often people roll with the $25 bottle. And that opens up a conversation about, again, how did we get here?
Yo, plug me in. Plug me in to the STEM Plug podcast.
Welcome to another episode of the STEM Plug podcast. Today, we have another amazing guest, Mr. Che, the Black Bourbon Guy. You know, we've dove into a lot of different areas within the STEM field, but today we have something much different, right? Today we're going to dive into the science of bourbon. That's right, the science of bourbon. And my guy, the Black Bourbon Guy, is going to plug it in for us. So how you doing today, Shay?
I'm great, man. Happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, for sure. All right, so let's just plug in, right? What really inspired you to start, the Black Bourbon Guy and bring the joy of good drinks to a wider community?
Somewhat similar to your path. I spent 20 years working in an industry where there wasn't a lot of representation at all. And the more I rose up the ranks within that industry, I realized that there was a lack of us, there was a lack of soul. And once I decided to get out of restaurants, I really had a passion for bringing that passion that I had developed over those 20 years to my own community and to as many communities as possible.
Wow. Okay. You were telling me, before we started the podcast that you studied biology in undergrad, right? How did that go? How was that?
I thought I was into it like a lot of undergraduates. And then very quickly I got tired of hearing about fruit flies, specifically Drosophila melanogaster. If I had to study those genomes for too much longer, I was going to lose it. So I decided to transition to psychology as a major. And like you said, we talked about this a little bit earlier, those soft skills that you learn as a psych major are important because it doesn't matter what industry that you work in, people are people, and people are everywhere. And whether it's in the STEM world, right, because you still have to relate to people, the ability to do that and to understand how to communicate what motivates people was huge, especially for me having a career in the restaurant business.
Okay. All right, so you went to the biology and then to the restaurant business, right? What was that key moment, I guess, that really, sparked your interest for, the spirits of like mixology and you getting into the bourbon now? What was that pivotal moment? Was it a certain drink you was like, wow, I really think I want to go into this now?
Great question. I started as a bio major, right? So at my core, I'm a nerd. No disrespect to anybody. I don't mean that in a negative way, but I consider myself a nerd at the end of the day. And so being in food and beverage, you have experiences, and somebody who is curious about things like I am, it's not just about having those experiences and leaving them in one place. It's about like, hey, how did this happen? How did we get here? And how can I recreate it, right? Because you can eat or drink for any number of reasons. You can do it out of necessity. You can do it to celebrate. You can do it because you're not feeling great at all, right? But few things can turn into an experience like a great meal and a good drink or a great bottle of whiskey or a good glass of wine. And I just really wanted to pursue that passion after having a number of those experiences in my own personal and professional life.
Okay. So a question I guess I want to know. I'm a wine drinker myself, but
Great.
bourbon is cool. I like bourbon, but what really defines bourbon as a specific type of whiskey, and kind of what are the key elements that distinguish that?
So, first off, if you're a wine person, you might one day like bourbon, right? Because when you get into the nuts and bolts of fermentation, they're all cousins, right? So, whiskey is a category of spirit that can be made anywhere across the world. And the loose definition of it is that it is a fermented grain product that is then distilled and aged in some sort of wooden cask, which is very similar to wine, right? Especially in the red wine world, the only difference is it has to come from grapes. There is no distillation, but you do often spend time in those same wooden casks. So there's a lot of flavor similarities that happen for scientific reasons, right? Because of different compounds that oak or other different types of wood impart into any liquid that you age in there. But also, I mean, fermentation is, at least one of the uses of fermentation is about creating ethanol. So, yeah, loosely defined, fermented grains, aged. But what separates the whiskeys is a matter of where it's made and the specifics of how it's made.
Okay. Yeah, that's an interesting question, right? Location, there's stuff where it's made, how can that have an effect on it? I guess let's dive into that more, right? How does the location and the climate really have an effect on types of bourbon? Do you have like certain types of bourbon that grow in like certain locations that are like in North Carolina or maybe California? How does that work?
So specifically, bourbon is a subcategory of American whiskey that has to be made from a mash bill, or basically what's a recipe of the grains that are milled and then fermented. The percentage of those grains determines what the category is for bourbon. So in this case, it has to be at minimum of 51% corn. It can be as high as 100%, but always minimum of 51. Typically, you mix two other grains in there, rye and malted barley. Wheat is another common grain that sometimes is mixed in, so they have 4-grain bourbons. They also have a whole category of bourbons called wheated bourbons. And for those, they've removed rye, which traditionally provides a little bit of spice to the recipe, and they've replaced wheat, which makes it a little sweeter, a little earthier. One of the fascinating things is even after you go through fermentation and distillation, where you're stripping out all of the proteins and you're essentially capturing the spirit of the ethanols, which are going for, those flavors come through. So what you start with is everything. But in terms of going back to your question, I'm meandering a little bit. There's a phrase in the wine world that the French use called terroir. And terroir is the soil. It's the content of the soil, chemical content. It's rainfall. It's exposure to sun. What direction are the fields facing that the grapes are growing in, right? There's so many things that will affect the final output because it all starts with some sort of living product. For wine, it's grapes. And if you grow a Chardonnay grape in Burgundy, it will grow very differently from that same Chardonnay grape growing in California. Things like exposure to sunlight means longer growing seasons, depending on the latitude at which you produce things. Hot days and cold nights, right, can also affect it. So specifically to bourbon, the most popular place for producing bourbon is Kentucky. A lot of people think that you have to make bourbon in Kentucky. That's not actually true. You can make bourbon in any U.S. territory. So if you wanted to set up shop on a military base in Guam, if you could get all the corn and the rye out there, I mean, that'd be an expensive trip, right?
Yeah.
But you could, in theory, produce straight bourbon whiskey in Guam, right? But something about Kentucky produced a product that everybody fell in love with. They say it's the limestone spring water. So their soil is very rich in limestone, right? So that water is filtered over and over again, just naturally. Also, limestone has a flavor to it that even again, after that fermentation and distillation, it carries through. Also, after the aging process in barrels, typically you add water to bring the proof down to whatever you want to bottle that product at. So the flavor of that water is everything, right? Like, no disrespect to New Jersey, but I'm never drinking a New Jersey bourbon just because I've had too much of their water and I. So the water's huge, right? Also, when you age a whiskey barrel, because by law, specifically for bourbon, it has to be aged for a minimum of 2 years. Most of the rick houses or warehouses where they age these things, they're not temperature controlled. So in Kentucky, you get hot days, especially during the summertime, right? But you also get cold nights, and that causes the barrel to breathe almost like a lung. So during the day, the heat causes the wood in that oak barrel to expand. It seals in all that liquid, right? Not particularly porous, but you build up a lot of pressure during the day because then some of the liquid inside the barrel, it evaporates naturally. That's, if you ever heard of a process called the angel share, that's what they're talking about.
Okay.
But then at night, cools down, that wood contracts, and that vapor breathes out, right? So that's a part of the whiskey maturation process. If you do that in a different place, you're not going to have the same result. Does that mean it'll be better or worse? Meh. You know, Scotland seems to do just fine in terms of making whiskey, and they don't necessarily have those hot days and cold nights, right? But their process is different, and their product tastes different.
Okay. All right. So I want to plug in more to the Black Bourbon Guy, right? So you have an amazing platform, right? And I've seen your content and different things you're making, and it's pretty dope. So how do you really, balance creating new and innovative, flavors while really maintaining that sense of, familiarity for your clients? How do you do that?
Part of it is being Black goes a long way. I mean, to be honest, at the end of the day, right? Like, how many companies do you look at and they put out products that are so tone deaf, and the first thing you think is like, yo, who do you have working for you? Like, you don't have nobody in your company saw this and was like, man, maybe we shouldn't do that, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, being a part of the community that I'm trying to reach out to is a huge part of it, right? A lot of what I do is trying to introduce flavors and things that are familiar to us, right? Things that come from the West Indies. My late grandmother was from Antigua, and I picked up a lot of my interest in the food world from her, right? So, I mean, one of the cocktail syrups I make is based off of a West Indian recipe called sorrel. So it's hibiscus, it's fresh ginger, it's baking spices. And if you go to Brooklyn, everybody knows what sorrel is, right? Because we have a strong West Indian population up there. So, like, even the hipsters are making sorrel tea at coffee shops. I mean, it's all over Brooklyn.
Word.
But once you get outside of communities where we have that much representation of different cultures, people know a lot less about it, right? So it's introducing things that we know are dope and just trying to get it out to a bigger audience.
Okay. So do you have a certain way that you kind of, educate people about the science behind the bourbon and stuff like that? I know you're here on the Stem Plug podcast, plugging it in, but do you have a certain way that you kind of, plug people in right now?
I mean, first and foremost is through the whiskey education sessions that I do. I prefer to do blind taste tests for people because, again, to what you said about plugging into the STEM side of things, whiskey is largely dominated by marketing. It's all about marketing, right? Very few people even want to talk about the science. And if you look at a lot of the bottles, there are a number of companies who play a smoke and mirrors game, right? They only post the information that they feel they need to post. And I don't know. It's a decision, a personal decision that companies make. But for me, at the end of the day, my whole goal is to get people to understand what does it for them, what processes lead to bottles that do it for them, and how you can identify those. So my favorite thing to do is to blind taste people. Whenever I do whiskey tasting events with people, about 90% of the time I roll with blind taste tests, right? Because if I set down 3 whiskeys in front of you and you think you know them, you will have formed an opinion about something that I can't break you from, right? But if I sit you down and say, we try those 3 in a blind format, 2 of them are ones that you know very well, but you don't know them because, again, blind format. And then the third one is a $25 bottle, right? You'd be surprised how often people roll with the $25 bottle. And that opens up a conversation about, again, how did we get here?
Wow. Okay. So what's the most popular bourbon that you've seen through your taste testing for people?
Everybody loves Buffalo Trace as a distillery. They are the most highly awarded bourbon maker in the world at this point. I mean, in the country, but by being the most awarded in the country, you are also in the world because you can't make it elsewhere.
Right.
But they're one of the few companies that has produced in some way, shape, or form before, during, and after Prohibition. Very few companies can make that claim. The only other one that I can think of off the top of my head is Old Forester. But that has positioned them for success in a lot of ways, right? Because whiskey history dates back to the 1700s. When Prohibition came through in the 1920s, and there were a handful of states that actually enacted their own personal prohibition laws well before federal prohibition hit. North Carolina was one of those states. We essentially kneecapped an industry that was booming, that was making us a ton of money, and that also, I mean, had a lot of guidance from the scientific community. It's fantastic how you look at the Industrial Revolution and all the advances in science and production we had, and whiskey as we know it would not be the same if not for those things, right? Prior to that, people were making stuff in their barns that would kill you or make you blind. It's
wow.
Improperly produced ethanol does bad things. Let me tell you. I have friends who are doctors who have done ER rotations in, more rural places and have seen folks come in with their entire optical nerve destroyed.
Wow.
And it's because they had an accident with somebody's shine.
Wow. That's no words for that. That's
science and whiskey, man. Science and whiskey.
I see. Okay. So do you have a favorite bourbon that you like to taste test, or your go-to?
That's tough, man. That's like asking me to pick my favorite child. And I have a lot more whiskey bottles than I do children. So much of it depends on my mood. I have a favorite style.
Okay.
I like big, savory, bombastic, frequently high proof whiskey, right? So I have a handful of brands that I like in that vein. Elijah Craig Barrel Proof, Larceny Barrel Proof, George T. Stagg Jr. But if I had to pick one of those as my favorite, I'm not sure I could. I will tell you the one that I have spent the most money on.
Okay.
And this isn't in terms of bottle purchase because I've never actually seen this bottle at what I would consider a reasonable price, but Old Forester makes a highly premium bottle called Birthday Bourbon. It's released once a year on the anniversary of their late founder, George Garvin Brown's birthday. Every year, it's a blend of specific barrels, might be 8 years old, might be 9, 10, 11, 12. They don't let it go until they know that it's ready, right? Which is important because whiskey is mature when it's mature. It's ready to drink when it's ready to drink. And every year for the last 5 years, I have paid $50 a shot for Old Forester Birthday Bourbon. I happily did it the first time I did it. I actually bought 2 of them because they had the 16 and the 17.
Yeah.
And every subsequent year, I have purchased a shot and never less than $50.
Wow. Okay. That's good. Do you have any I guess certain pairs that you like to do with any foods or anything specifically, or
100%. I mean, two of the, I call this easy money, but bourbon and corn, right? Anything corn related. They say if it grows together, it goes together. Bourbon is made from corn as the dominant product, right? So if you pair bourbon with really anything corn based, there's just a natural synergy that jumps out. When I do tastings, I love to bring along popcorn, kettle corn, caramel corn works really well also. The flip side to this, and this is more of a kind of contrasting pairing, is chocolate, specifically dark chocolate. Whenever you age something in oak, cocoa is one of the very present flavors that you get out of there, right? So whether you're into California Cabernet or anything that spends enough time in an oak barrel is going to pick up some either chocolate or bitter cocoa flavors. And so you sip some bourbon with a nice quality piece of dark chocolate, and let me tell you, that's where it's at.
That's where it's at.
It might change your life.
Had to take the sip of drink at that. No, I feel you on that. Yeah, so I'm amazed by everything you just plugged in with me about, just about the science of bourbon, right? And you told me about, how you started off in the restaurant industry and stuff like that. And I know the restaurant industry is a tough industry to be in, right? So even pertaining to bourbon, give me like what's been kind of some of the most challenging aspects of just your journey within the area of bourbon. What's been challenging? Has there been any challenges that's hit you, or?
I mean, one of the biggest challenges is people, and I'm sure you can relate to this. People look at you and their response is, "Who are you?" in parentheses, black dude, right? And so there were times where I was the general manager of a $7 million restaurant in Raleigh, and I would go to talk bourbon to a table, right? Because a server would come to me and they say, "Hey, these guys are really into bourbon. You should come over and holler at them." And I'm happy to run my mouth to anybody about bourbon. And I'd be there trying to talk to them enthusiastically, trying to make a sale, trying to hook them up. And just the whole ethos that you would get from them is like, who are you and why are you here, right? I know some white people who have been GMs at restaurants, and I have never heard any of them say that they got that kind of response from people. So just not being what people expect in the world of whiskey has been a challenge. I mean, the whole whiskey world is dominated by big boisterous dudes with giant beards, some of them wearing ascots, but none of them who look like us, right? And so just because you don't carry that look, people almost make you prove yourself, which is frustrating and annoying to have to do time and time again, especially when, at the end of the day, I like to think that I know a little something about whiskey, but, it is what it is. I deal with it a little bit less now that my platform has grown, but I mean, in the restaurant world, that was always a struggle. And, I would be talking to people for whom, like, listen, man, I've forgotten more about whiskey than you probably will ever know.
Wow.
And I have to sit here and, let you question my credentials.
Yeah. No, I feel you. Hey, I look at it as your cheat code, man. That's how I look at it, right? You authentic, you yourself. Nobody can take that away from you, right?
Right.
So, that's dope. So, what are your I guess future ambitions with the Black Bourbon Guy? Where do you kind of see it going in the future?
Right now, I'm working on really building the product line because the events have been great, right? But products are much more significant way for me to continue to get the message and the culture out to a much broader audience. Like I can only do but so many whiskey education sessions, right? And I love them, and I'll keep doing them, and I'll keep telling the stories about those of us who have been involved, those of us who are involved, and those of us who will be involved in the future, right? But by just sitting a cocktail bottle in somebody's house, right, I can send a case of cocktail syrups to California, and each of those syrups can tell a story to somebody that might not be familiar with it. So that's the big push right now, to just continue to get the product side, and I mean, just to continue to spread the message that, like, look, you know who likes whiskey? Everybody. Everybody.
Yeah.
And the more comfortable we feel in those spaces, I mean, the better off it is, right? I have a late colleague of mine who used to say that diversity provides a certain richness to every situation. And it's amazing how many bourbon groups are completely lacking in diversity. And it's like, man, y'all missing out on so many fun things, so many fun perspectives, so many fun conversations. And for me, at the end of the day, the act of sitting down and sharing a drink, it's deeply shared cultural ritual that exists in just about every culture, right? Like, other than people who just decidedly don't drink for whatever reason, it don't matter, man. Like, black folks, white folks, and the thugs, everybody sits around and has sharing a drink as a ritual, right? So one of the shirts that I sell on my website says that bourbon is for everybody, right? Because like many drinks, bourbon is for everybody. So is cognac, not just for black people. Thank you very much.
Wow. Okay. All right. So plug in your how can our listeners really stay in touch with you, as far as all your different platforms and stuff like that? How can we stay in touch?
So you can find me at the Black Bourbon Guy, just about everywhere. IG, Facebook. If you go to my website, www.blackbourbonguy.com, I have a newsletter that people can sign up for. It keeps people updated on my events, but also cool stories in the bourbon industry. Like, I just did just sent out my newsletter this week, and one of the stories that I was really happy to tell was that there is a bourbon maker in Kentucky by the name of Fresh. They're in Lexington, Kentucky, and they're owned by a husband and wife, both fantastically black couple. And they are, as far as I know, the first black distillery to be included on the official Kentucky Bourbon Trail. Which is a big effing deal from where I sit. You know what I mean? So I just love sharing those stories. So yeah, follow me on any of those platforms, LinkedIn. Try to keep it simple for folks.
Okay. You have any events coming up, in the area in North Carolina or anywhere else you want to plug in?
I do. So one of the cool events that I have going on right now, it's a series. I partnered with a dope event space in Raleigh on South Person Street called the Artist Lounge. Okay. So this couple, Reggie and Georgia, they bought this beautiful property and landscaped the backyard and studio into a gorgeous kind of outdoor oasis that sits very unassumingly right smack in the middle of Raleigh. And every Friday, we're doing a whiskey and cigar pairing called the Oak and Smoke series. So for the first couple hours, people can come on out, do a fun blind whiskey tasting, get to learn a little bit of education, a little bit of history. And then after that, we break out into a nice little kind of social mixer in the outdoor space where people are invited to enjoy some cocktails, enjoy some drinks, but also enjoy some sticks, which are not my forte per se, but I do enjoy them.
Yeah. Nah, that's dope. Well, we really appreciate you plugging in today with us, the Black Bourbon Guy. This is another episode of the Stem Plug podcast. Make sure you like and subscribe and keep tuning in to the Black Bourbon Guy. We're going to have some more from him coming soon. Stay plugged in.
Thank you.